Do you know what a stakeholder analysis is? Doing a stakeholder analysis is really important, especially for nonprofits, because you have a lot of relationships you need to manage. Doing a stakeholder analysis will not only help you understand how to better manage your relationships, but also help you think about your stakeholders' perspectives so that you can be sure to collect data that's really meaningful to them. My name is Michelle Molina. I'm from Connecting Evidence, and I help nonprofits and coalitions collect data so that they can make improvements to their work and hopefully make better informed decisions. And in this video, we're going to talk about how you can do a stakeholder analysis so that you can collect meaningful data. I want to make sure that you are not overwhelmed by data, but instead that you feel confident in your abilities to use data so that your nonprofit or coalition can have the things it needs to make informed decisions. So that's why I made this YouTube channel, and if you want more videos on a regular basis, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification button so that you're notified when I post a new video. And at the end of this video, I'm also going to tell you how to get my guide on developing a theory of change. So doing a stakeholder analysis is one of the steps you can take while you're developing a theory of change. And if you remember, developing a theory of change is one of the things you can do when you're trying to determine what sort of data you should be collecting, because it helps you identify which outcomes are important. So be sure to download that so that you can have not only the steps to doing a stakeholder analysis, but also have an understanding of what a theory of change is and how to create one. The first step is to brainstorm stakeholders. So stakeholders are pretty much any individual, group, coalition, organization that might have some stake or interest in your work. So, for example, stakeholders might be internal individuals, groups of people, or they might be external. Some examples of stakeholders include your staff. They might be funders, volunteers, your participants. They might be your board members. Pretty much what I want you to do in this step is to brainstorm a list of anyone who has some sort of interest in your work to some extent. Next, you want to go through your list of stakeholders and ask yourself how they fit into your work. So for each person, I have a set of questions you can go through and ask yourself, and those questions will be in the download I offer at the end, so stay tuned for that. But I'll go over the list very quickly. Generally speaking, you want to think about how the stakeholder fits into your work and why they care about your work. For example, you might ask yourself, how are they connected to your work? Why are they interested in your program or initiative or the work you do? What is their position? Is it positive or is it negative? Are they a supporter or are they a potential obstacle? What outcomes are they most interested in and why? So again, I encourage you to go back to the theory of change video. I also made a video on the difference between outcomes and outputs for you to check out. But generally, what sort of changes do they want to see in their community, and why are those sorts of changes important to them? This is the sort of step where after you complete this list, you want to look at the sort of outcomes that are important to your key stakeholders, and then look at your theory of change to explore if those outcomes are present there. How do you communicate or engage with this sort of stakeholder? And if you have an individual person, so for example, if the stakeholder represents a stakeholder group or a coalition or an organization, then do you have a contact person that you communicate with regularly? And is the extent to which you communicate with the stakeholder or a stakeholder group enough? Another question you can ask yourself is, how might the stakeholder be engaged in data collection or any evaluation activities? So are you going to be gathering data from them? Are they going to be providing data? Are you going to be sharing data with them? If so, when? And through what means? Once you have answered these questions for all the stakeholders you brainstormed, what you want to do is reflect on your responses and consider whether or not there's anything else you might be able to add, or if you are happy with the situation related to the stakeholder. For example, if you looked at how you plan to engage with the stakeholder in data collection or evaluation activities, is that really the way you want to engage them in that activity? Do you want to engage them more? Do you want to engage them less? Those sorts of things that are the sorts of things you should be reflecting upon once you have this finished list. Personally, I'm very interested in learning about how you plan to engage your stakeholders in data or evaluation related activities, so let me know in the comments below. The next thing you want to do is a power interest analysis. Now, in this sort of activity, you look at each stakeholder and you ask yourself two questions. So you ask yourself, one, how much power or influence does the stakeholder have over my work? And two, how interested are they to hear about the things I do? So what ends up happening is you'll have stakeholders fall into one of 4 categories based on your responses to these 2 questions. I'll run through these fairly quickly. The first group I'll talk about are those who have high power and high interest. This is the group that I have, or we usually call key players. Key players are the sorts of stakeholders that you want to spend most of your time and resources in keeping happy. This might look like figuring out ways to engage them in ways that will push their interests in positive ways. So for example, if you're doing evaluation related activities or data collection activities, you want to engage them as much as possible. This might mean helping them or having them help you develop tools or instruments to collect data, or think through the processes you're going to use as you're collecting data. It might mean having them provide data to you, or it might mean having them participate in sense-making sessions, or what I like to call data parties. This is sessions where people get together and review the data that has come in to think about its implications for the future of the work that they are all doing. So as much as possible, you want to encourage these stakeholders to be involved in your work in a positive way and in a way that will help foster future buy-in. The next group of stakeholders I'll talk about is those that have high power but are low interest. These are the sorts of stakeholders you want to keep satisfied, and you want to be selective about what you ask them to do for you or the amount of information you share with them, because you don't want to overwhelm them and you want to ensure that their interactions with you are positive and not, again, overwhelming. So these are the sorts of stakeholders you'll include probably in key decisions, but they won't be involved in the nitty-gritty details of all your plans. These are the sorts of stakeholders you'll probably invite to sense-making sessions, but they won't help you plan out your sense-making sessions, or might not be involved in implementing your next steps, for example. So generally speaking, you want to keep this group satisfied and well-informed, but you want to be selective about what you ask them to do for you and what you share with them so that you don't overwhelm them. The next group I'll talk about are those that are low power but high interest. These are stakeholders who are interested in your work but probably are not able to make decisions about the sort of things you do. That's why they're in this category. I usually call these supporters. So what you want to do is consider how you can leverage this group's support to further your work. For example, they might be thought partners, or you might partner on projects in the future because you have interests that are aligned. So you want to keep an eye open to these stakeholders, but you're probably not using a lot of your time and resources to fully engage them regularly. In the final category, we have low power and low interest. So these are stakeholders that are not very interested. That's why they're in this category, and don't have the power to influence your work. Again, why they're in this category. Here, you kind of just want to monitor any upcoming trends that might be happening in their world, keep an eye out for potential areas of collaboration, But generally speaking, you're going to or should spend the least amount of time focusing on this group of stakeholder and trying to engage this group of stakeholder. You want to focus on engaging the other categories of stakeholders more because they are both interested and or have the power to influence your work. Now that you have categorized your stakeholders or organized your stakeholders along these two continuums, what I want to ask you to do is to spend a little bit of time reflecting. And I have some reflection questions in the Theory of Change guide for you to check out later. But generally speaking, you want to consider your current situation and whether or not it is the ideal situation. So look at how your stakeholders fell and consider whether or not there are stakeholders who should fall into other categories. So for example, are there key players who should really be supporters? Or are there advisors who should really be key players? Do you have too many key players? So those are the sorts of things you want to ask yourself. Another thing to keep in mind is that while you're doing this activity, it might be hard to really think about who has power and who doesn't. Generally speaking, if you're working in a nonprofit or are a part of a coalition, you're doing work to serve community members that in the traditional sense of things might not be considered as very powerful. However, because they are your participant or because you're doing work specifically to improve their lives, they have the power, or at least should have the power, to influence your work. So although a group of stakeholders might not have power in the traditional sense of things, because they have the power to influence your work, you can consider them as a powerful stakeholder. Finally, what I'll ask you to do here is to consider who has decision-making power. So think of who is involved in your decision-making process and put a little star or a circle around their name to consider where the decision makers in your nonprofit or coalition lie. Another thing you can do also that might make things interesting is to consider who are the beneficiaries of the work you do and to put a different mark around them and to consider whether or not there is an overlap between those who have decision-making power and those who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the work you're doing. If you're doing this as part of a theory of change process, what I want to ask you to do is to consider your key players and your advisors and think about what their most important outcomes are or what are the changes they're most keen on seeing in the community. And consider your theory of change and where those key outcomes may or may not fit within the work you do. The last thing we're going to do for our stakeholder analysis is a closeness activity. So here we have a diagram where we have concentric circles and at the center is our work. So if you're doing this for a program, you can write down the program's name or you can write down your initiative's name. What you want to do here is organize stakeholders based on how close they are to your work's implementation. So if they are benefiting from the implementation on a one-to-one basis, you can put them right at the middle. If they're actually implementing the work that's being done, you can put them right at the middle. The further out you get, the less in touch or less of an understanding the stakeholder has to the work that's actually being done and how it's being implemented. The purpose of this is to help you understand the extent to which stakeholders will have to be reminded of the context of your work and the principles behind your work when you're asking them to be thought partners or you're asking them to help you make decisions or you're sharing any sort of information with them. The further out a stakeholder is, the less they'll know about your work. That's why you put them there. So you'll have to spend some time reintroducing your work to them so that they're able to help you in the way that you're asking them to. Another thing you can do to make this activity interesting is to put a mark or highlight or circle the stakeholders that have decision-making power. And reflect on whether or not you have enough stakeholders making decisions or helping you make decisions that are really close or integral to your work's implementation. If all your decision makers are at the outskirts, you really need to think about how you're distributing power within the work you do. Another thing to keep in mind is that those close to the center of this diagram, those are the sorts of people you want to have review your theory of change, if not even participate in developing it, because they're so integral to the implementation of your work or have a deep understanding of how your work is implemented. They'll be very suited to help you develop a theory of change. Don't forget to download my guide on developing a theory of change. I go through the various processes there, including how to do a stakeholder analysis, which is what I described in this video. So if you want some more details and some quick reintroduction to the topic, make sure to get that download. I also have some reflection questions there for you to consider as you're going through the process so that you're better able to get data that's really meaningful for your organization or your coalition. The link should be somewhere on the screen right now. You can also find it in the description below. Remember, I made this channel to help nonprofit professionals or people who are a part of coalitions use data more effectively and gain their confidence in their ability to use data. So if you want different video topics, please let me know. And if you found this meaningful, make sure to like it, subscribe, and comment below. I have other videos for you to check out too. For example, I have a couple of videos on a theory of change, a logic model. I also have a video on the difference between outcomes and outputs, and we'll be making more videos soon.